To commemorate the start of our 5th season of On Becoming a Healer, Stefan and I are revisiting a conversation that we had a couple of years ago about the wisdom of a physician who profoundly influenced us and who has shaped almost everything that we talk about here. What we'd like to share are pearls on topics ranging from ambition in medicine to judgmentalism to empathy to shared humanity and to caring. In my view, these are not the platitudes that we all too often hear. Instead, they often go against the grain, and they challenge us to rethink our preconceptions. And speaking personally, I found them to be very helpful, not only as guides to practicing medicine in a way that feels rich and meaningful, but also to living in a way that fosters connection. So, without further ado.
So, Saul, I know today we're going to be talking about the words and wisdom of a family physician and psychiatrist who not a lot of people have heard about, named Dr. Simon Auster. Tell us why we're talking about someone not a lot of people have heard about.
So, Stefan, as you know, Simon was as you said, a family physician and a psychiatrist who actually taught at a medical school for 30 years, mostly first-year medical students, actually. And he was also my godfather. And of course, as you know, he died just as a pandemic was getting started. I think it was in January of 2020. He was in his late 80s. And one of the things that I've always wanted to do is share what I would call uncommon wisdom. Simon was one of those unique people who often seemed like he came from a different planet. It's not just me that has said that about him. He kind of had this ability to just see things from a point of view that initially seemed strange, but then once you got to know him better, you realize that actually we are the ones who are strange, and that he's looking at things from a remarkably grounded place. And over the years, he had these sayings that he would repeat in different situations. And again, what struck me about them is they're not things you usually hear, and often they go against the grain. And Simon was someone who loved being a doctor. He loved patient care. He loved teaching. He never burned out. And I think we should take people seriously who enjoy their work that much. And then, of course, medical students and patients often just were so appreciative of having him as either their teacher or as their physician. So I'm hoping today to just talk about some of what we might call Simonisms.
Well, let's have at it. We have before us a list of a few of the key sayings and teachings of Simon Auster, and we're going to just try them out one at a time and see how we resonate with them. I might ask a few questions. I suspect Saul will have a little more to say about what Simon might have meant. One of these is meant to bring us down to earth, I think, and it's on shared humanity. It says, never forget that you defecate, micturate, and fornicate the same as your patients do. I have to ask Saul, did he really use those words, defecate, micturate, and fornicate?
Actually, he preferred not to. And because this is a podcast, I think I'm allowed to quote him accurately. And he used to say, never forget that you shit, piss, and fuck the same as your patients do. But he also knew that that probably wouldn't fly in certain settings, and he came up with this alternate format. So both of these are authentic Simon.
George Carlin would salute him. But okay, society's filled with portraits of flawed doctors, doctors who have drug problems, doctors who are difficult people. Is this important for us to reconsider the idea that we shouldn't forget that we are like our patients in these ways?
You know, I found this quote very helpful personally as a physician. I find sometimes when I'm in a room and a patient smells bad, or they pass gas, or they throw up, or they seem totally confused, there is a tendency to react by pulling back from them, to see them as kind of gross. And that's when a quote like this is so valuable. That's when Simon is saying, look, buddy, the tables could be turned. You're the one who could have the diarrhea. You're the one who could smell bad. And quite honestly, connect with this person as someone who, like you, is fully human. And that is so helpful, I think, when we're in situations with patients and we find ourselves distancing ourselves from them because of characteristics that they're exhibiting that are quite literally human.
Yeah. Sometimes I think that, and this, maybe it's as I've gotten older, next time it'll be me in that bed.
Well, if you're lucky, it will. That's what happens to all of us unless we end up 6 feet under before we get there.
Yeah. So with that kind of tone setting, we're going to turn to another here. There's one that I think is tricky, which has to do with empathy. I have often heard medical students, doctors say, one of my goals is to be an empathic physician. And the quote I'll turn to here is, if empathy is feeling another's pain, there's no clear role for it in medicine. Caring and kindness, however, make a physician more effective. Why wouldn't I feel another's pain, and why wouldn't I want to do that if I want to be a helpful person?
Obviously there's a debate about what the term empathy means, but for the purpose of this discussion and for the purpose of the way I think Simon using this term, it means a feeling. And one of the things Simon has said is that quite literally, a patient has never benefited from something you're feeling, literally. And so all that matters is how that feeling is expressed in a behavior by you as the physician. And, we've talked about this on other episodes. He has described a colleague of his who's probably on the spectrum in terms of seeming like they don't express any empathy when they're with patients, but is deeply caring. And I think that was really what Simon is getting at here, that what really matters is the attention you give to being helpful to others, to asking them thoughtful questions, to listening carefully. What you're feeling is irrelevant. And I think he takes it even further than that. He described once being in the room with a deeply depressed adolescent. And I should mention, Simon had originally, at one point, had been a psychiatrist who cared for adolescent patients. And he said there was this brief moment where he experienced what he thought was what she was feeling. And he said it was so distressing that it completely derailed him, and he hoped never to go there again. So I think that Simon's point is that that's not necessarily helpful. It isn't really what your patients need. And it's really much more about the caring you show them, however you get there.
I have to comment that on my psychiatry rotation as a medical student, I do remember reaching a point of despair. I was working on an inpatient service and talking at great length with individual patients whose situations were just unfathomably difficult and feeling, as I felt at the time, completely overwhelmed. And I contacted the course director to say I wasn't sure I was able to deal with the clerkship. And the course director was extremely supportive, but he said, this means that you're really present, that you're doing the work, that you're actually in this rotation. You're where I would expect you to be if you're working hard on this clerkship. I don't know for sure what that course director would have said in response to Simon. I suspect he would have meant that it's normative to go through a period where you do feel all that pain. It may not be the case that you need to, though. I'm curious, what do you think Simon would have made of my distress as a medical student encountering patients with overwhelming problems?
Well, Simon had another quote that I want to share because I think it speaks to that. He said, "Don't fool yourself into thinking you can understand others. All we can know is how another person makes us feel, and that can be a useful tool for the physician." And I think his point there was, for instance, if you're feeling distress or perhaps you're feeling depressed when you're around a patient, that may be a sign that the patient is depressed. Of course, that's only if you react to people who are depressed with depression. In other words, you have to know yourself well, and you have to be able to calibrate yourself. And that may not, in fact, be why you're feeling down while you're with a patient. So there may be multiple reasons. But he said that, and again, I'm jumping now to another quote by him. He said, "Feelings are just data. You don't act on data until you have analyzed and understood it." So when we have feelings in response to another, we have to be able to analyze those feelings and figure out what they're telling us about the situation. And they may be telling us something that's not useful, that's really much more about something that's been going on in our life, or they may be telling us that there's a red flag that we need to pursue in understanding the suffering that this other patient is experiencing. That's why that capacity to process our own feelings in a sort of analytic way is so valuable and so important. Now, the feelings that you were having as a medical student were obviously quite distressing if it got you to the point where you were wondering whether you could do your job as a student. Exactly. Yeah. And so I think Simon would have just said to you, well, clearly those feelings were not helpful. And I don't think he would say that it's great that you're having those feelings. Yay. I think he would say, let's talk about how you can move forward in this clerkship, given the distress that you're experiencing. And that would require some reflection and some insight. But I don't think he would give you a thumbs up because you're feeling miserable.
Which I was.
Yeah. He would say that's an emotion that needs to be processed in order for you to move forward and be effective as a clinician. It doesn't necessarily mean pulling back and kind of creating a barrier with the patient. He wouldn't make those assumptions. He would say it means figuring out what those feelings are and then figuring out how you can move forward effectively as a clinician. And one of the things he often talked about was the importance of asking patients questions as a profound sign of caring, and also a way to connect with patients on solid ground. Because if you start asking patients about what they're experiencing, what they're feeling, and they start to tell you, now you're really talking. It's no longer just about you, it's about them. And that's really what taking care of patients is all about. It's about them. And I think he might have suggested, and I don't want to speak for him because he's not here, he's not alive, but he might have suggested that you respond to that by starting to ask the patient questions about their situation, and that might change the dynamic in your head so that you're now focusing on what they're experiencing and no longer experiencing your inner distress from whatever it may be coming from.
One of the things I hear there is that asking the question to the patient, how much hope do you have about this situation? What do you see in the situation? Why do you feel the way you do? And what would you hope you could have happen here? All these questions directed at the patient, if they're offered in the right moment in a caring way, have this dual purpose. On the one hand, they're to lay bare what matters to that patient, but also to take you out of your emotional frame set back to return the camera to the patient, right?
Absolutely. Also, it's part of learning to calibrate yourself. For instance, you might discover that the patient isn't actually particularly distressed at that time, that they're actually doing pretty well, in which case you would have to say to yourself, my goodness, I was experiencing a lot of distress because I was making some assumptions about this patient that turned out not to be true. And that's useful. That's part of the learning process.
You know, I think the nice aspect of my little story where I called the course director was that I knew I had overwhelming feelings and I called somebody to discuss them. But a lot of times in clinical care, there are these moments where the feelings are present and driving what we do, but we had no idea we were feeling at the moment we spoke. I see or hear my colleagues or even myself say something in anger or say something that's detrimental toward thinking clearly, but I do it instinctively. I can't believe the patient just did that. Oh my God, he just decided he wasn't going to do what we recommended. No wonder he's back here again. What are the feelings in that moment when I'm saying that? Exasperation, a little bit of anger, annoyance, perhaps some judgment. So this gets a little bit, was he always able to see when he was having an emotion before he acted on it?
I can't speak for him on that. I think that he would say that it behooves us as physicians to get to know ourselves so that we are aware of the emotions we're experiencing and are able, quite analytically, to think about what the implications of those emotions are for our patient care. And so, for instance, if we're getting frustrated and angry at a patient because the patient is, quote, non-compliant, and that is causing us to perhaps interact with the patient in a way that's a little snippety, and we're perhaps losing interest in connecting with the patient, that obviously has negative implications for patient care. So he would say that that's a point where we need to start to reflect on what's going on with those emotions. Now, he wouldn't deny those emotions. He would say, your mind, you may feel like strangling the patient, and that's fine. But what really matters is your ability to separate those emotions from how you actually interact with that person. And so I don't think that Simon was denying the validity of those feelings. He would just say that you need to be aware of them, and you need to make sure that they don't interfere with engaging with the patient. And, we've talked in earlier episodes about boundary clarity. Boundary is ability to know the difference between what's me and what's you. And those feelings are me. And I need to know those feelings are me. And I need to make sure that that they don't get in the way of my interaction with that patient.
Let's turn to another quote. It gets to this issue of reacting to patients who you might be frustrated with. It's on judgmentalism. When you judge another, you have stopped thinking. You have moved from a cognitive process to an emotive process. Judgment, he says, is not thinking.
Yeah, I think this is a really profound insight because we're always told, don't be judgmental. And
it's a little scold, right? Don't be judgmental. That's bad.
Yeah, and what Simon said is there's actually a reason it's bad that I had actually never heard anyone articulate before, which is that once you pass judgment on somebody, you have essentially decided you know why they don't show up for appointments. You know why they don't take their medications. It's because they don't have a good attitude, they don't care about their health, et cetera, et cetera. That's judging another. And Simon would say that once you've said that, you no longer have any reason to ask them why they keep missing appointments because you've already decided. You've decided they've stopped coming to appointments or being reliable because they're just unreliable. On the other hand, if you're not judgmental or if you realize you're being judgmental and you can set it aside, you might say to that patient, hey, I noticed you were late for the last couple of appointments, so you didn't make it. Can you tell me what's going on? And you might find out at that point that there's a whole story, that that person's partner is terribly ill, that they just lost their job and they've been working extra hours and it's getting in the way of their ability to make it to all kinds of things could come out. And what Simon is saying is that once you pass judgment, your curiosity disappears because you think you have the answer to a question that you haven't even asked. And I think that's such an interesting insight about why being judgmental is a problem.
Let me follow up on that, because sometimes the pushback against judgmentalism begins to sound to many in medicine like a request that we simply accept behaviors, situations that probably are adverse to health. And I'll give you the simplest example. And this is one where the words stigma and judgment come up all the time. People who are overweight or obese. An argument can be made, look, we do so much harm with the way that we judge people who are overweight or obese. We really should recognize that's who they are. We need to accept that that's who they are. What is the point of engaging in anything that looks like judgmentalism? So am I not supposed to speak about someone's weight or the fact that it's probably going to affect their health adversely so that I don't inadvertently seem judgmental? What would you think would be the right thing to do? How do we approach that?
I think overweight is such a significant issue right now in healthcare. We did a whole episode, as you know, on gaslighting. And one of the most common areas where gaslighting occurs is when a patient is overweight and a physician just starts badgering them about their weight, when in fact the patient has other priorities and other things they want to talk about, but the physician has this single-minded focus. And I think we have to acknowledge that what's going on in that situation is that the physician is being driven by their own agenda. For whatever reason, they are bothered by the fact that the person who has come to see them is fat, and they are haranguing them for it. And that's a good example of not recognizing that the emotions you're having have nothing to do with providing good care. And that if you're having that reaction to a patient because you have this deeply ingrained cultural prejudice towards overweight, that has no place in patient care any more than racism or sexism. On the other hand...
Yeah, I want the on the other hand.
On the other hand, yes, obesity is a factor in chronic illness. It contributes to a whole range, as you know, of chronic conditions. And in that context, it is absolutely appropriate to talk about overweight. And I think that patients know the difference between a physician who is badgering them and a physician who cares about them and cares about their health, including their diabetes, their hypertension, their struggle with their weight. I think it really is evident to patients when they're being gaslit and because they feel demeaned. I don't think that's the case when a patient is cared about by a physician who is taking this holistic approach to helping them, which includes, in some cases, talking about their weight.
There's a related statement on judgmentalism I just want to quote. People do the best they can with what they've got, even if we think it's not very good. At one level, this seems to suggest that almost every person has, to date, made the best possible decisions. Although, even if I look at myself, I'm not sure I've made, to date, the best possible decisions.
Well, Simon would say that you have made, I think he would say you've made the only decisions you could make because, and this gets to a kind of existential issue, you are a product of your DNA, the genes you inherited, and the every experience you've had up to the present moment. And that is going to express itself in a series of actions you take. If you're trying to decide whether you're going to have pizza or burritos for dinner and both are in the freezer, you're going to pick one. And maybe you had walked by a pizza joint on your way home and you loved the smell, and that triggered your decision to go for the pizza. And so that was a chance event, and that's also a factor in decision making. So I think we get to this sort of existential question of what does it really mean to make a choice? So I think Simon would say, we may as well call it the best decision, but we could also call it the only decision. He had a longer version of that quote, which I want to share, and I put it in as the epigraph to one of the chapters in my book on becoming a healer. It's actually chapter 4 called Overcoming Judgmentalism. And he said, in our lives, we do the best we can with what we've got. Our choices may seem strange to others, funny, frightening, or simply stupid. But in the balance of our lives, as we see it, those are the choices that make the most sense. And I think he's saying that when we're with patients, or with anyone for that matter, we may look at the choices they're making and say, boy, that's dumb. And from our perspective, maybe it is. Maybe it's not a very bright idea to not take your antibiotic for 3 days for whatever reason when you have an infection. But you, the patient, had some rationale for doing that. And it's not that you sat there and said, I want to do something really dumb today, so this is what I'm going to do. Simon is making a statement that gets to the core of what it means to not be judgmental of others. It's a kind of categorical way of looking at the world that is fundamentally non-judgmental. And personally, I think it's fundamentally grounded in reality. People really are not going through their day saying, what can I do that's stupid now? People are actually making decisions on a moment by moment that seem to make sense. Otherwise, they would have made a different choice. So I think that's why Simon's insight is fundamentally true, as well as helpful.
People are not going through their day thinking, what can I do that's stupid now? But they are going through their day often choosing things that later they think, oh, that really was stupid, right? Like back through the camera.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, that is not helpful because they now have information or they're in a different state of mind than they were at the time when they made those decisions.
So I do want to turn to that issue of how we assess ourselves. We were talking about how we assess patients, but Simon speaks a lot about, there are several quotes on our sheet that pertain to how we look at ourselves. These have to do with ambition. I'm going to relate one, but want to see if you have others. When you feel like you need to accomplish great things, and I think this is directed at doctors, but when you feel like you need to accomplish great things, you are impoverished. Learn from life instead. Let me just set this up for a sec. I'm a medical doctor. I'm a full professor. There are people I see seek and obtain awards, projects, acknowledgement from our employer, praise from patients and administrators and nurses. Medical students try to get into AOA if they have that at their medical school. So Simon says, when you feel like you need to accomplish great things, you are impoverished. Who is he speaking to?
Well, I think he's speaking to all of us. I think that, and I have to say, I don't know that much about Zen, but I think of this as a sort of Zen view of life, which is the idea that what really counts is the present moment. And that when we're thinking about things that distract us from the present moment, we're diminishing our lives. That if you're with a patient and you're thinking about a grant proposal that you would rather be writing because if you get that grant, that's going to maybe get you a promotion or accolades or an award, and that patient is trying to talk with you about their depression, their medical condition, or anything, and you're not fully present, not only are you compromising what that patient has come to you for, which is your full expertise and your value as their doctor, but you're also compromising yourself because you're not engaged. And engagement and connection is what gives us joy and meaning in our lives. And I think that's what he's telling us.
It is the case that Simon worked in a medical school, right?
Yeah.
Medical schools are filled with markers that you have to check, pass, gain. Some schools, depending on your position, you may be discharged if you do not get the marker. So it almost feels a little inhuman to say, when you feel like you need to accomplish great things, you are impoverished. How do I say that to a young faculty member who's worried about being tossed out on their butt?
I think that he would say that trying to keep your job is not the same as trying to accomplish great things.
Okay.
He would say that that's a practical task that has to be part of your career plan. So if you want to become a tenured professor because that's the career that you believe is going to give you the most joy and meaning, if you've made that decision, you've made that assessment based on the best available evidence you have, and that's grounded in a meaningful understanding of the pros and cons of taking that career path, as opposed to just wanting to please your dad who's a full professor. You see what I'm saying? In other words, this is truly grounded in what you think is going to give you the most joy and meaning in your life. Then that is going to require accomplishing a set of tasks that you are going to have to plan, and you're going to have to plan them strategically, and you're going to have to pursue them. But when you're in the room with a patient, that's when you want to be focused on that person only and nothing else. And if your mind is wandering, then that's the issue he's concerned about. I think he's also distinguishing between that very straightforward, pragmatic approach and this hard to characterize idea of what it is to be ambitious.
Yeah.
And Simon did not like the concept of ambition. He thought that ambition impoverishes people. The idea that I want to become a full professor because I've decided that's going to give me joy and meaning in my life, if that is grounded in an understanding of who you are and what you want, I don't think he would call that ambition. And again, this is the way he uses the term. Ambition is this hunger that is almost never satiated.
Yes.
And that's what he is talking about.
Yes, guilty as charged. I feel like I have that.
That hunger that is never satiated, that is ambition. One of the things that he said that I think characterized this well is he said, when you are chasing after something, you may not realize when someone is in your way and run them over. And it's a wonderful metaphor. I mean, it's a horrifying metaphor.
Yeah.
But what he said is that if you are constantly chasing, you are kind of like a steamroller. You're not going to be present. You're not paying attention to what's happening to you all the time. And that ambition is going to probably hurt other people, because once you have that craving, then other people don't matter as much as getting there. And then you're going to start stepping on people. And I think that's what he's saying when he says that.
So I value that. Actually, I want to comment that for me, at least, there's been this sort of yin-yang love-hate with ambition, which is to say, I've often tried to seek what is the expected marker for my profession, and at times have wondered, why can't I achieve as many of them as somebody else? And I think it's probably at one level only human, that we look at others who beat us in sports or have gotten more awards and say, well, why can't I be like that? And I'm not sure it's as dangerous to others, but I have wondered if Simon would have seen that as dangerous to myself to ask those questions that way.
Well, I think, one of the things that's interesting, and this is a bit of a tangent, but you'll see where I'm going, is that the reason we're here talking about somebody who very few people have heard of is because Simon had absolutely no interest in being heard of. And as a result, he was very comfortable speaking truth to power, saying whatever he thought needed to be said, not concerned particularly about whether it was going to compromise his career. Simon never became a full professor. It just wasn't important to him. What was important to him was pretty much one day at a time. As I've talked about on other episodes, his door was always open. People could come in and talk with him about what they were thinking. They had to be ready to be challenged by him. He wasn't just someone there to affirm whatever somebody wanted to have affirmed. He would challenge people in an effort perhaps to help them grow. But I think that Simon, you could say he paid the price, right? He never became a full professor. He certainly never became famous. I think in my opinion, I think he was brilliant and insightful. But I say pay the price with tongue in cheek, because quite honestly, he could have cared less about any of those things. It just wasn't the way he was wired. But as a result of it, he loved every day he went to work. That guy was always having fun.
Wow.
And I never saw anybody practicing medicine who had such a great time. And that's what he got for that.
Did we already discuss chasing after anything as the pathway to suffering?
Well, that's a famous quote.
It's
I believe.
not from him, is it?
Well, it's interesting. I think he may have said that, but I think, and again, I'm not sure, but I think that is sort of a philosophy of Zen, in a sense. So I wouldn't just give Simon credit for that, but I would say that that's something that he would have certainly said as well.
The issue of understanding who we are can apply to being a physician. It can apply in other settings, but there is this a couple of teachings from Simon on that particular issue, and I want to turn to both of those if you'll permit. If you don't know your own issues, you won't know how to keep them out of discussions with your patients. And he added, Socrates was wrong. There's nothing wrong with living the unexamined life unless you are a physician. So what's the issue of physicians not knowing their own issues?
Well, another quote by Simon, which I think speaks to this, is he said, "Professional distance is necessary only when the patient needs to be protected from the dysfunctional elements of a physician's character." And what I love about that quote is it turns the whole conversation about professional distance on its head. Usually we talk about professional distance in terms of how it's important for the physician to keep an emotional distance from patients so they don't burn out, for instance.
Yeah.
Simon didn't think that was the case at all. He said that, in fact, physicians burn out because they don't engage, they don't connect with their patients. They find no joy in those interactions because they're holding patients at arm's length. And that, I think, is also, I found to be very helpful. But what he is saying is that if you have issues that lead you, for instance, to feel anger towards patients, or frustration, or are highly judgmental, or are racist, or are sexist, or whatever, and you're not aware of those issues, and you can't set them aside, then that spells trouble for your patient. If you're a farmer, for instance, and I don't mean to single farmers out here, but if you're a farmer, when you go out into the fields every day, that's not a situation where you need to know what your issues are because you're not responsible for a person who has come to you for help who's highly vulnerable. That's the difference.
I do have moments at work where I recognize a surge of emotion and realize that it is absolutely useless and I'm not going to pay much attention to it. I wonder if I've absorbed a little bit of that wisdom in those moments. We have gone through a fair number of these, and I wanted to ask you if you had one or two that you feel we shouldn't close out without discussing.
Well, there's one. Unfortunately, I don't have it written down, but I'm gonna wing it here. Simon often used to say that he hadn't worked a day in his life, and he compared going to work like being in a sandbox in a playground. And one of the things he talked about is that when you're in a sandbox in a playground, there are going to be some bullies. There are going to be some people who come in and kick sand in your face, and that's just part of the price for being in the playground. He also talked about the fact that when you go to work, it's not all fun and games. You have to write notes. Simon hated writing notes, for instance. He hated working with the electronic medical record. But that's, again, part of the price. And he just factored that in. You got to do it. It's part of the price. And I think that's useful because he didn't let it demoralize him. He took it as just part of an overall package that he wouldn't trade for anything. And I think that's a helpful insight as well.
Yeah, people speak a great deal, and we have spoken about the travails of modern medicine. Oftentimes we have acknowledged that there's institutional and political pressures upon us. And yet it sounds like Simon was able to see the work he was doing on his own terms, with his own mind and heart, so to speak, rather than letting others define it, even though they were requiring him to do stuff, which is kind of striking, actually, and does recapitulate that idea that he was a little bit of an alien.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that being an alien can be so helpful when the rest of the world is a little bit crazy.
I think that could be a great point to close out, but I do want to ask a question just in case we decide to focus on it. But where did Simon come from? Where did he grow up? And what happened in his life that got him to where he is?
So what I'm going to do is post a link to an online article about his life that was published in the Pharos, which is the Journal of the Medical Honor Society, shortly after his death. And the article, you can Google it, but I'm going to put a link there so that those of you who are interested can read about Simon. And I can tell you it's a very remarkable story. He had a pretty remarkable and I would say extraordinary life. There are also a lot of quotes that are in that article, some of which we've talked about and others as well.
Well, I really appreciate that we took this episode to focus on uncommon wisdom from Simon Auster. We could call them Simonisms. And I thank you so much, Saul, for sharing with us your experience of a man who is both a doctor, a person, and also your godfather, and an inspiration behind your work who's reverberated to so many of us.
Stefan, thanks for giving me the opportunity. We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Also, please rate us on the Apple Podcast app as it will help others find us. And if you have a few moments, leave a review. In addition, if you'd like to make a comment about this episode, we'd love to hear from you. There are a couple ways to do that. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, then just open the episode website link and enter your comment there. Or you can directly go to the website contextualizingcare.org, select the podcast tab, and then scroll down and click on the episode. There you'll find the same comment box. Finally, you can always reach us at onbecomingahealer@gmail.com.